Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If you're new to the show, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here on Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Commander's Quarters decks are built on a $25 budget, that's $25 for 100 cards. But before we get started on today's episode, make sure you go hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date on the latest Commander's Quarters deck techs. Today's commander is going to be Vaevictis Asmadi the Dire. He's a 6/6 flying elder dragon that costs 3 black, red, green. And whenever Vaevictis Asmadi the Dire attacks, for each player, choose target permanent that player controls. Those players sacrifice those permanents. Each player who sacrificed a permanent this way reveals the top card of their library, then puts it onto the battlefield if it's a permanent card. Vaevictis Asmadi has a very unique ability and one that we really haven't seen on a commander before. There are definitely positives and negatives to this ability. On the positive side, we get to get rid of our opponent's best permanents. On the negative side, they might actually hit a better permanent off the top of the library and get to put into play for free. And then on our side of the board, a negative is that we have to get rid of one of our own things as well. But if we play our cards right, we can make sure that we hit better things off the top of the library than what we got rid of. So our strategy for this deck is to manipulate the top of our library in order to get big things out. We want to make sure that we're always trading up for the permanent that we are sacrificing. How are we going to win with this deck? Well, we're going to decimate our opponent's boards and outvalue them. The vast majority of decks aren't set up to manipulate the top of the library, so we have an advantage over our opponents. They also are most likely going to be running some non-permanents, but we run 100% permanents, so we never whiff. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. Let's move on to tactic number 1, Land of the Dragons. Vaevictis Asmadi has a converted mana cost of 6, and we need to get him out as soon as possible to get that value engine running. We also want to make sure that we have things to sacrifice to his ability, so we're going to be running a lot of permanent-based ramp. Elvish Mystic is a mana dork that comes down on turn 1 and taps for a green. Then there's Elves of Deep Shadow, which taps for a black and deals us 1 damage when it does so. By paying 2 and tapping it, we can sacrifice Wayfarer's Bauble to search our library for a basic land card and put into play tapped. You can sacrifice Diligent Farmhand for 1 and a green to search your library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Dawn Trader Elk does the exact same thing, but he can do it for just a green. And then Sakura Tribe Elder can do it for free, making him one of our best sources of ramp. When Wood Elves enters the battlefield, we can search our library for a forest and put into play untapped. Then there's Farhaven Elf and Yavimaya Granger, each of which do the exact same thing. When they enter the battlefield, we can search our library for basic land and put into play tapped. Yavimaya Granger does have a downside though, it does have an echo cost. Next up is Elvish Rejuvenator, which has, when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then there's Fertilid, which enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters, and we can remove a counter for 1 and a green to go search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Finally, we've got World Shaper, which can be our biggest source of ramp for the deck. Whenever it attacks, we're going to put the top 3 cards of our library into our graveyard, and then when it dies, we get to put all land cards from our graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. With this deck, we might already be sacrificing a lot of lands to our commander's attack trigger. We're also running plenty of lands that sacrifice themselves and go into the graveyard. And to top it all off with World Shaper's ability, we can put a ton of lands into play at once he dies. Now that we've talked about getting our mana set up, let's talk about getting the top of our library set up. It's time to go on to tactic number 2, top it off. Seer's Lantern is a mana rock that can either tap for a colorless, or we can pay 2 to scry 1. Darksteel Pendant is an indestructible artifact that we can pay 1 to tap and scry. And then there's Crystal Ball, which costs 3, we can pay 1 and tap and it will scry us 2. Scrying is going to be a big way for us to set up right before our attack. Sifter Worm is a 7/7 with trample, and when it comes into the battlefield, we're going to scry 3 and then reveal the top card of our library, and then we gain life equal to that card's mana cost. Sifter Worm is a great hit off the top of the library because he helps us set up our next turn. We can pay a green and tap Gilt-Leaf Seer in order to look at the top 2 cards of our library and put them back in any order. Then there's Ashnod Silex, which we can pay 3 to tap in order to look at the top 3 cards of our library. We'll put 1 back on top and exile the other 2. Next up is Explorer's Scope, which is a great piece of equipment to put on our commander. When Vaevictis Asmadi attacks, we can stack the triggers so that the scope goes first. By doing this, if there's a land on top of our library, we get to get it out of the way and onto the battlefield and hopefully get something better with Vaevictis Asmadi's trigger. Then there's Dryad Greenskeeper, which we can tap to look at the top card of our library, and if it's a land, it goes into our hand. We can pay 2 to tap Druidic Satchel to reveal the top card of our library. If it's a creature card, we put a 1/1 Saproling into play. If it's a land card, we put it onto the battlefield under our control. And if it's a non-creature, non-land card, we gain 2 life. The 2 life isn't all that great, but getting the land onto the battlefield is big, and then also getting a Saproling to sacrifice is also big. Finally, we're running Garruk's Horde, which is a 7/7 Trampler that has play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. Knowing what the top card of our library is huge for us. And if there's something like a Mana Dork on the top of our library, we can cast them to get them out of the way. So we've talked about some ways that we can manipulate the top of the library, but there are other ways as well. Let's go on to tactic number 3, Cherry on Top. Conch Horn is an artifact that we can pay 1 and tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards, and then we can put 1 card from our hand back on top of our library. Essentially, this card lets us cheat a card from our hand into play for the cost of 1 mana. When Brutalizer Exarch enters the battlefield, we choose one of two modes. We can either choose to search our library for a creature card, reveal it, and then shuffle our library and put that card on top of it, or we can put target non-creature permanent on the bottom of its owner's library. The vast majority of the time, we're going to choose that first mode so that we can search our library for any creature and set up our next attack with Vaevictis Asmadi. Then there's Conduit of Ruin, which once we cast it, we get to search our library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, reveal it, shuffle our library, and put it on top of it. On top of that, it also makes the first creature spell that we cast each turn cost 2 less to cast. So not only do we get to search our library for one of our best creatures and put it on top to set up Vaevictis Asmadi, it's also going to help us cast some of those big creatures in our hand that we otherwise wouldn't be able to cast. Then there's Haunted Crossroads, which is an enchantment that has pay a black, put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. This card is insane in this deck. Right before we attack, we can put one of our best creatures from our graveyard on top of our library to go into play for free. Then there's Watuao, Honored Physician, who does pretty much the exact same thing. He has tap, put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. We can only activate this ability though during our turn and before attackers are declared. Again, that's exactly when we want to activate it though, so it's not really a restriction for us. As you can see, there's plenty of ways for us to set up the top of our library for our commander's attack trigger. But what happens when Vaevictis Asmadi dies? We don't want to stall out, so let's go on to tactic number 4, start your engines. Fires of Yavimaya is an enchantment that gives all of our creatures haste, and then we can also sacrifice it to give target creature +2/+2 until the end of the turn. Then there's Swiftfoot Booch, which is a huge card in this deck. It's going to give Vaevictis Asmadi hexproof and haste. It's very important for us that we can start our engine back up and just keep going like nothing happened. But it's even easier for us if we can protect him in the first place like Swiftfoot Boots does. Let's go through some more ways that we can protect Vaevictis Asmadi in tactic number 5, Dragon Scales. Alpha Authority is an aura that's going to give one of our creatures hexproof and can't be blocked by more than one creature. And then there's Aspect of the Mongoose, which is going to give one of our creatures Shroud, and if it's put into the graveyard, we get to return it back to our hand. Emissary of Grudges is a 6/5 with flying and haste, and when it comes into play, we get to secretly choose an opponent. If that opponent targets one of our permanents with either a spell or ability, we can reveal that we chose them and then change the target of that spell or ability. We can only do this once, but it can be a huge effect that can turn around a game. Then there's Temur Sabertooth, which has pay 1 and a green, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until the end of the turn. So if someone tries to wipe the board, we can just bounce Vaevictis Asmadi back to our hand, and Temur Sabertooth will stay alive on board. Then we've got Soul of New Phyrexia, which is a 6/6 that has trample, and we can pay 5 to give permanents that we control indestructible until the end of the turn. Also, if it's in our graveyard, we can pay 5 to exile it to give permanents we control indestructible until the end of the turn as well. Once this guy comes down, we're going to want to make sure that we have 5 mana open at all times to prevent ourselves from getting wiped out by a board wipe. Finally, there's Garnet the Bloodflame, which is a 3/3 with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, we return to our hand all creature cards in our graveyard that were put there from anywhere this turn, and then it also gives other creatures we control haste. Not only does Garnet help us recover from board wipes, but it also gives our creatures haste, so as soon as Vaevictis Asmadi comes back down, he can swing right away. Alright, since we've talked about protecting our dragon, it's time to move on to tactic number 6, feeding your dragon. With this deck, we want to make sure that we have plenty of expendable permanents on the battlefield so that we can sacrifice them to Vaevictis Asmadi's attack trigger. When Mirror Battlesphere enters the battlefield, we get to create 4 1/1 colorless Mirror Artifact creature tokens. It also has its own attack trigger where we can pump it and then also deal damage to the defending player, but the main thing that we care about with this card are those 4 tokens. Then there's Mitotic Slime, which is a 4/4, and when it dies, we get to create 2 2/2 green ooze creature tokens with, when this creature dies, create 2 1/1 green ooze creature tokens. Basically, at the end of the day, counting the original Mitotic Slime, we end up with 7 creatures that we can sacrifice. Next up is Symbiotic Worm, which is a 7/7, and when it dies, we get to put 7 1/1 green insect creature tokens onto the battlefield. Both of these cards are great at supplying us with a ton of sacrifice fodder. Then there's Ogre Slumlord, which has, whenever another non-token creature dies, you may put a 1/1 black rat creature token onto the battlefield, and rats you control have Death Touch. Since Ogre Slumlord also applies to our opponent's creatures, we can get a ton of rats for us to sacrifice. Then there's Overseer of the Dam, which does something similar, and when it comes into play, we get to destroy target creature. And whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, we get to create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. We are going to be making our opponent sacrifice a ton of permanents, including creatures, so we will get a lot of value out of these 2 cards. Next up is Rampaging Baloths, which has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast creature token. This guy will generate a ton of value for us since we have many ways to get more than 1 land onto the battlefield in a turn. Then there's Verdant Forest, which has, at the beginning of each upkeep, create a 1/1 green Saproling creature token. Note how it says each upkeep, so every single time around the table we get 4 Saprolings. Next up is Dragonlair Spider, which has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. This guy can create far more tokens than any of our other token producers. When Sepulchral Primordial enters the battlefield, we get to put 1 creature from each opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. We are going to be killing a lot of our opponent's creatures, and this guy helps us steal some of their best ones. Finally, there's Phytotitan, who might be the best sacrifice outlet for our commander. When Phytotitan dies, we get to return to the battlefield tapped under our control at the beginning of our next upkeep. So even if we sack him to our commander's trigger, we get him right back at the beginning of our next turn. Again, so while we have to sacrifice our own creatures, every single time we attack with Vaevictis Asmadi, we're making our opponent sacrifice permanents too. But we even have more ways to deal with their threats, so let's go through some of those in tactic number 7, can't get any worse. Now our commander's ability does target, so we can't kill creatures with hexproof. That is, unless we have Bonds of Mortality in play. Bonds of Mortality is an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield we get to draw a card. We can then pay a green to have creatures our opponents control lose hexproof and indestructible until the end of the turn. So just when an opponent thinks their creature with hexproof is safe, we can take it away from them. Then we're running some other cards that help us take away our opponent's permanents. When Bane of Balaget attacks, the defending player is going to have to exile 2 permanents they control. Then there's Ulamog's Crusher, which has Annihilator 2, which basically means that whenever it attacks, the defending player will have to sacrifice 2 permanents. Artisan of Kozilek also has Annihilator 2, but it also has when you cast this spell, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Most of the time we won't be casting this guy though because of his converted mana cost of 9, but when it happens, it's pretty nice. Next up is Tyrant's Familiar, which has Lieutenant, which says, as long as you control your commander, Tyrant's Familiar gets +2/+2 and has, whenever it attacks, it deals 7 damage to target creature defending player controls. Then there's Bogardan Hellkite, which has Flash and Flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. Magmatic Force is a 7/7 that has, at the beginning of each upkeep, it deals 3 damage to any target. Again, this is even on our opponent's upkeep, so we'll be pinging a ton with this guy. These 3 guys are really good at clearing out some of those creatures that are sticking around on our opponent's boards. Perhaps the best, though, at clearing out our opponent's boards is Butcher of Malakir. Whenever Butcher of Malakir or another creature we control dies, each opponent has to sacrifice a creature. We have plenty of creatures in this deck that sack themselves, and we can also sack a creature each turn with our commander's trigger. Then we have Deathbringer Thoctor, which benefits from all those creatures dying. Whenever another creature dies, we put a +1/+1 counter on Deathbringer Thoctor, and then we can remove a +1/+1 counter to ping either a creature or a player. This guy can get huge quickly and will help us ping down either our opponent's creatures or their life totals. Finally, we've got Terastodon, and when it enters the battlefield, we can destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents, and for each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Now those 3/3s aren't going to be a big threat to us, and this guy helps us get rid of any pesky artifacts, enchantments, lands, or even planeswalkers. We can abuse our opponent's boards very easily with this deck, and even more so with this upcoming card. Let's go on to tactic number 8, it just got worse. The golden pig of this deck is Grave Betrayal. Grave Betrayal is an enchantment that costs 5 black and says whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. We just went over a ton of creatures that help us kill our opponent's creatures. And on top of that, we have a commander that does it for us. Even with just our commander's ability, we can gain control of 3 of our opponent's best creatures. This card needs to be dealt with immediately, or it just swings the game so much into our favor that it's almost impossible for our opponents to recover. Not only are we gaining control of their best creatures, but it's also preventing them from playing new ones. Even if they have an amazing creature in their hand, they're going to be hesitant to put it down since we're just going to kill it and gain control of it. Whatever hope our opponents had of coming back is gone as soon as this card hits the board. So if they don't have a response for it right away and we get 1 attack off with Vaevictis Asmadi, it's pretty much just game over. And now that we've talked about some of the most powerful cards in the deck, let's talk about some of those cards that help us with our engine. It's time to go into tactic number 9, Big Gains. Soul of the Harvest is going to draw us a card whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control. And then there's Harvester of Souls, which is going to draw us a card anytime another non-token creature dies. In this deck, both of these guys are going to draw us a ton of cards. Finally, there's Verdant Sun's Avatar, which is going to gain us a ton of life. It has, when Verdant Sun's Avatar or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to that creature's toughness. This guy is huge in keeping us alive while we keep our engine running. Now with a deck, it's always good to have repeatable effects, especially when those effects are much like your commanders. Let's explore some of those in tactic number 10, Imitation is Flattery. With Call of the Wild in play, we can pay 2 green and reveal the top card of our library. If it's a creature card, we put it into play, otherwise it's going into our graveyard. Then there's Impromptu Raid, which is very similar. It's going to cost us 1 less to activate, and that creature gains haste, but we're going to have to sacrifice that creature at the end of the turn. Finally, we've got Aid from the Cowl, which can be even better, and it pretty much just doubles up Vaevictis Asmadi's trigger. Aid from the Cowl is an enchantment that has Revolt. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a permanent card, you may put it onto the battlefield, otherwise you may put it onto the bottom of your library. So since Vaevictis Asmadi is already going to make a sacrifice a permanent, this is going to trigger every single turn we do that. And then every single card in our deck is a permanent, so this card can't miss. This deck is a ton of fun and can be extremely powerful. Being able to play a ton of huge things for free while destroying your opponent's best things is just an amazing effect. But now that we've gone through all the cards that help us win, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. We're going to be running 37 lands in this deck, including Savage Lands, which comes into play tapped and taps for any one of our colors. Then there's Timber Gorge, Gruul Guildgate, Kazandu Refuge, and Rugged Highlands, each of which enters the battlefield tapped and taps for either a red or green mana. On top of that, Kazandu Refuge and Rugged Highlands will both gain us a life when they come into play. Foul Orchard, Golgari Guildgate, and Jungle Hollow each enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a black or green mana, and Jungle Hollow is also going to gain us 1 life. Then there's Bloodfell Caves and Akuum Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped, gain us a life, and tap for either a red or black mana. We can sacrifice Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. By paying 1 and sacrificing Jund Panorama, we can search for any one of our basic lands. Grixis Panorama does the exact same thing, except it can only search for a mountain or a swamp, and Naya Panorama does the same thing too, but it can only search for a mountain or a forest. We can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice either Warped Landscape or Terminal Moraine to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. Next up, we've got Mosswort Bridge, which is a hideaway land. This means that when it enters the battlefield, we get to look at the top 4 cards of our library, exile one of them face down, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. It does enter the battlefield tapped, and it taps for a green, but the main thing is that we can pay a green to tap it and play that exiled card without paying its mana cost if creatures we control have a total power of 10 or greater. Then there's Zolfrin Void, which only taps for a colorless, but when it comes into play, we get to scry 1. Mortuary Mire is a great include in this deck. When it enters the battlefield, we get to put target creature card from our graveyard on top of our library. Then we're running 17 basic lands. 10 of those are going to be a forest, 4 will be swamps, and 3 will be mountains. Alright, now that we've gone through every single card in the deck, let's do a quick price check. Our deck costs are calculated using TCG Player Optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Vaevictis Asmadi EDH rec deck is going to set you back $470.87. Let's see how we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable at $24.89. Again, with our Commander's Quarters decks, they're built to be tuned and focused within that $25 budget, but there's always ways that we can improve on them. Let's go through what some of those ways just might be with our reasonable upgrades. Courser of Crewfix comes in at $3.45. She's a 2/4 that costs 1 green and has play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Again, it's very important for this deck to remove lands from the top of our library so we don't hit those with Vaevictis Asmadi's trigger. Then we've got Atali Primal Storm coming in at $4.40. Atali is a 6/6 that costs 4 red and has whenever it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library, then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So with Atali, we not only get to cast the top of our library as long as it's not a land, but we get to cast the top of our opponent's libraries too. Next up, we've got Lurking Predators, which is $4.81. Lurking Predators is an enchantment that costs 4 green and has, whenever an opponent casts a spell, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise you may put that card on the bottom of your library. This card is insane in Commander. Since we're playing with multiple opponents, we're going to get a ton of triggers off of this. Then there's Spearbreaker Behemoth, which is $1.99. The Behemoth is an indestructible 5/5 that costs 5 green and has pay 1, target creature with power 5 or greater is indestructible this turn. This guy is a great addition to the deck and is what we need to help us protect some of our valuable assets, including Vaevictis Asmadi. Next up is Pathrazor of Ulamog, which comes in at 99 cents. It's a 9/9 that costs 11 and has Annihilator 3, and it can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. With Annihilator 3, this guy helps us devastate our opponent's boards even further. Finally, there's It That Betrays, which costs $6.56. It That Betrays is an 11/11 that costs 12 mana and has Annihilator 2, and whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, put that card onto the battlefield under your control. This guy is probably the best out of all the reasonable upgrades. With all the Annihilators that we have in the deck, as well as Vaevictis Asmadi's trigger, we're going to be gaining control of a ton of permanents. And with that, our show is coming to a close, but I really want to hear what you guys think about this deck, so why don't you comment below to let me know. Also, make sure you're following us on both Twitter and Facebook so that you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. The links to our Twitter and Facebook can be found in the description below. Also in the description below is a link to our Patreon page, and I just want to give a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron of the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future Commanders for deck techs. There's even a new general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of our other deck techs. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.